And it was also a family, and that's why I'm always happy. My colleague Adam Dick and I work together at the Ron Paul Institute. My old colleague Norman Singleton is with Campaign for Liberty, and it's a real pleasure for me to introduce another colleague of ours who started out as press secretary and ended up as chief of staff, and now he's the president of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, one of the best organizations out there. And that is Jeff Deist. Jeff.
Daniel. Gary Haven was like a double black espresso, no sugar, no cream. But thank you for that. Everybody enjoying Joe Rogan and ivermectin?
I'm gonna take Kalen's spot.
A week ago it was Afghanistan, a month before that it was Cuba, so try to keep up. And that's one reason that I'm so appreciative of the Ron Paul Liberty Report every day, which I usually can't catch live. I watch that night, but it's like a little bit of a homecoming for me, and you know, gets me out of the madness because consistency is so hard to find right now. So some of you may know the name Alex Berenson. He is a former New York Times reporter. He's also a novelist, just a fearless guy. He's been incredible on Twitter over this COVID pandemic. Just calling out all the folly of these policies. And he's also been very good about showing the very mixed reality behind all these official assurances we've been getting about, you know, distancing and masks and vaccines and all that. So he's been really something on Twitter, a force. And he's probably best known, this is over a year ago, he came up with this saying which caught fire virally. He said, "Virus gonna virus."
Yeah.
And what we've seen and what's borne out since he said that is that whether you're in Sweden or Australia, whether you're in New York or Florida, whether you have mask mandates, whether you have lockdowns, whether you have school closures or business closures, whether you have vaccine passports, none of these things have really mattered too much at the end of the day. Virus gonna virus. The deaths and hospitalizations will be concentrated amongst the elderly, people with immune issues, obese people in almost any community, anywhere on earth. 2/3 of the deaths are over 70. But even over 70, there's a higher than 90% survival rate with COVID. And of all COVID deaths, I don't know if you know this, only about 7% are COVID only. Okay, there's almost always other existing conditions. So we know that virus is going to virus. But here's what we don't know because we don't have a control group. We'll never know what would have happened if you had just done nothing. If you had done nothing but allow citizens to exercise their rights to move around, to build up their natural immunity, maybe through a healthy diet, through exercise, vitamins, how about sunlight? Sunlight is this thing that you get when you go outside. So all of this is the unseen. And it's actually, you know, literally doing nothing may well have resulted in fewer deaths and hospitalizations because we may well have gotten some form of herd immunity sooner. We can't know. We'll never know. And I'm not saying that. But we definitely know that taking precautions for the immunocompromised people, for the elderly, while allowing younger people to go out and live their lives and be healthy would have gotten us to this natural immunity much faster and with a hell of a lot less collateral damage to our psyches, to our health, to our economy. So back to Mr. Berenson. It comes from the left ideologically, by the way. So last week, Twitter decided it had enough of Alex and permanently suspended his account. And this is no small matter for an independent journalist because he's left the New York Times and he relies on his Twitter account to direct people to his Substack, I believe, where he has a paywall and can actually make a living. And we sure as hell need independent journalists like Glenn Greenwald making a living right now without these goddamn media Because imagine if just 100,000 people gave Glenn Greenwald $5 a year. That's $500,000. He can make a living, he can travel, he can be independent. Yep. So if you go down Berenson's Twitter account, it just says account suspended. And what's so spooky about it is his profile's just gone. His little header photo, the round thing, is gone, but also the profile photo is blank, and the little descriptive bio he had is gone as well, so it's just blank. And when you look at it, it reminds me of that famous old photo of Stalin. He's standing next to the Moscow River, and I had to look it up, I didn't know. The guy next to him is Nikolai Yezhov, who, of course, was a local deputy, and he later fell out of favor when Stalin was executed. So that's why he's not in the picture anymore, and I'm not sure, they didn't really have Photoshop then, but they had something for the Soviet engineers and photographers, so they erased him. And so now Alex Berenson has been similarly unpersoned. He's been erased, he's been removed. But even if he ends up a casualty of this war, and I hope you'll check him out, maybe we can support him. But whether you agree with him or not about COVID and some of the treatments, people like him have really managed to challenge the official narrative in ways I think that were unimaginable even 20 years ago. So the financial journalist John Tamny, who I saw recently, he writes for Forbes and Real Clear Politics. He made a point, he said, no matter what your beef is with Facebook and Twitter in particular, he said, I personally, meaning John Tamny, have gotten a lot of great information and sources via Facebook and Twitter, during this entire COVID period. And as I thought about that, I had to agree. That's been true. Most of the counter information I've gotten against the official narrative, I've gotten via social media. So I think that's a happy and healthy thing. But what we haven't gotten from our media, of course, is a true understanding of all the economic fallout and damage from this reaction to COVID, not from COVID. So I want to talk about that a little bit today, because I think we're kidding ourselves about the degree of damage that's been done, and we'll all be back to normal soon. And we know whenever there's a crisis, and whenever there's not a crisis, governments are good at two things. They're good at bossing us around, and they're good at spending money. They do both of those things in spades whenever there's a supposed crisis. And of course, both Congress and the Fed went into hyperdrive beginning last March. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? The Fed has pumped more than $9 trillion into the economy via its primary dealers. Some of these are loan facilities, some of these are asset purchases from commercial banks. $9 trillion. In fact, it's estimated that 20% of all the dollars ever created, US dollars, were issued in 2020 alone. 20% of all US dollars. Now some of those are paper and some of those are electronic. So on the fiscal side, Congressman Massey mentioned the rotten CARES Act, but Congress has authorized more than federal agencies to dole out about $3.2 trillion on the fiscal side in COVID stimulus spending. So all that adds up to $12 trillion in direct inflationary pressure applied to the U.S. economy. And this is, of course, countervailing force against deflation. All the deflationary pressures when people go home from work. They're not working. They're not traveling. They're not producing in their jobs. They're not eating out as much. They're not buying gas as often. Of course, all these things are hugely deflationary and naturally deflationary. They should be deflationary. That's what you want.
Right.
And whenever there's a crisis, whenever there's huge times of uncertainty, you can absolutely write this down. People will do this 99.99 times out of 100 is they start to save money. Cash balances go up. Okay, people don't know if they're going to keep their job. They don't know what's going to happen, maybe with their spouse's job. So the natural thing is, especially since they're not allowed to go out of their houses in some cases, is they spend less. So their cash balances go up. This is naturally deflationary. So this natural process, which is as natural as anything in nature, it's part of human nature, this natural process, our government exists to thwart it at every turn. That's their job, is to create inflation when the world wants deflation. This is a sickness, folks. This is a mania. So some of you know the name Hans Hermann Hoppe, economist, social philosopher. He has this great dictum. He says, markets produce goods. Goods are the things we all want and willingly go out and consume and buy. But governments produce bads, which is to say things we don't want. Governments give us bads. But worse yet, they do this with our money, which reduces the amount of money we all have to go out and buy the actual goods we do want. And of course, it reduces production of those goods as a result. So the past 16 months, we've had a hell of a lot of government bads. We've had this in spades. And I would say most recently, we've witnessed what our federal government is producing worsts. We're doing even worse than bads. And maybe the two biggest worsts of of our era are the COVID and Afghanistan debacles. And they're going on simultaneously, and the parallels. I know it's facile to compare COVID with Afghanistan and the government's inability to manage a faraway country in the Middle East or its inability to manage a virus, but I like facile things. So I'm going to go with it. I think it's a great analogy. So one of the bads, maybe one of the worst, which government produces is, of course, misinformation. So another analogy we can draw between COVID and Afghanistan is this phenomenon which you can talk to generals and military about. It's called the fog of war. So the fog of war is a term that's been used over the years, and it describes generally this uncertainty in situational awareness that's experienced by participants in military operations. Things are going on, information's imperfect, bombs are going off. So some of you will know the name, and I'm going to paraphrase him, von Clausewitz. He said, well, war is the realm of uncertainty. The factors on which action is based in war, they're wrapped up in uncertainty. And fog and friction, they cloud a commander's judgment. Even when the commander is ostensibly, I would argue not, but ostensibly on our side. And the government, the federal government in particular, has been the commander for the last 18 odd months. So when we declared war on a virus, clarity went out the window. And so we've lived for 16 months in this fog of COVID misinformation, and we're still living it. We still don't have definitive answers to these simple questions because they keep moving the ball and moving the goalpost. Do masks really work? Can anyone tell me that definitively? No. Do kids really need masks? Where's the proof that masks benefit kids? As an aside, a friend of mine, Richard Ryder, lives in San Diego County, where my wife and I used to live. There's about 3.4 million people in San Diego County. There has been one student death. One student death in that county. That student had some other health problems. They shut down their public schools for a year in San Diego County. How long does immunity last after you've had COVID? How long does it last after the first shot, the second shot, the third booster, the 10th booster? How long does this last? How many vaccines will we need to be fully vaccinated?
There's 8 slots on the cards.
Yeah, how many boosters? So here's a question I asked back last March. How do we even define a case or an infection if somebody shows no symptoms and feels fine? What's a case of COVID? What does it mean to be infected with COVID? If you're not sick, you're not sick. And so on. This is the fog. But maybe the most shocking thing from my perspective, in the world I live in, about the last 16 months is this inability to consider economic trade-offs. I'm not only talking about, of course, the obvious economic consequence of shutting down the world and the horrific financial damage it has done and will do to millions of people in this country. I'm not only talking about depression and isolation from friends and loved ones and untreated illnesses and suicide and alcoholism and weight gain and obesity and child development, infants seeing their mother in this mask. So, these are more social questions that are beyond my pay grade. But I'm just talking about the basic economic trade-offs of this so-called COVID policy: supply chain, food, energy, unemployment, housing. And let me tell you something, food is a little bit different matter in the third world than it is here. We're talking about people really on the brink of real starvation because we decided we want to shut down the world. And as an aside, I truly believe that part of the reason they shut down the world was to get Trump. And it worked. They got it. But I can't stress this enough. If you take away just one thing today from my remarks, is that we now have millions of Americans who have literally no conception of basic economics. And they simply don't believe trade-offs exist. There are no trade-offs. They think, and they're encouraged to think this way by the political class, the government can simply print money in the form of stimulus bills to pay enhanced unemployment benefits to stay home. Congress can just print money and give it to businesses in the form of PPP loans, and oh great, hey, we can make payroll, we have some money. We don't have to have people at work, they can still get their paycheck. That the CDC, of all the cockamamie federal agencies, the CDC can impose a rent moratorium and effectively vitiate millions of local contracts, which have always been written and enforced at the most local level. And that all this will just somehow work itself out. It's fine. That the Federal Reserve can simply buy up assets from commercial banks and command lower interest rates almost by magic to stimulate housing and consumerism and cars. They sold more cars in 2020 than the auto industry in this country has ever sold. You can't even get a Ford F-150 right now. So millions of Americans, through sheer ignorance of economics, literally think all of these actions I just described are costless and wholly beneficial with no downside. So this is what we're up against. And now we wonder, why can't the economy just flip a switch and get back to normal? Right? It's got an on-off button. It's back here. Well, that's not how it works when we've got this incredibly complex global supply chain with just-in-time delivery. No businesses want to have inventory like they did 30 years ago. That's not how it works. And that's why thousands upon thousands of Ford F-150s are sitting in stadium parking lots unsold and unsellable because there's a global semiconductor chip shortage. Chips make Ford F-150s go, apparently. They're not like the cars I remember as a kid. And of course, many of the chips we use in this country, about 70% of them come from a single source in Taiwan. So semiconductor chips are in everything, folks, today. They're in your iPhone, they're in your refrigerator, they're in your Microsoft Surface laptop, they're in your Xbox. So there was this remarkable op-ed a couple days ago in CNBC, and it was about the disruptions to the global supply chain, the interruptions. Now, this particular article, it gets the cause of inflation wrong, which I wouldn't. It doesn't shock me with CNBC, but nonetheless, because it blames everything on the pandemic rather than central banks and the reaction to the pandemic. But it paints this really vivid picture of the serious problems that are facing this overstressed global supply chain. The manufacturing sector, delays in delivery are said to be the longest they've been in decades. And so inflation plus delays is bad news when you put those two things together, because at all the stages of production, with either capital or consumer goods, all these businesses and suppliers and middlemen, they don't know what to charge a price for anything. Because what's it going to be 5 months from now? If I don't get it for 5 months, what should I pay for it today? This is a huge problem, folks. So how many construction projects were blindsided by this 5 times run-up in timber prices last year? A lot of them. So we've got ports, the Port of Los Angeles, Long Beach, with hundreds and hundreds of ships parked outside, waiting, anchored. They can't deliver their cargo, and every day they're burning money. It's like parked airplanes. Because at the ports themselves, there's not enough trucks and truck drivers to take the cargo containers away. The cargo containers usually sit for about 3 days. They're sitting for 2 weeks. And of course, that affects the train lines. And that affects your toothbrush that you go buy at Target. And with all this uncertainty, including with fuel costs, delivery costs for a lot of businesses have gone up 10, 15 times. And so it's not just uncertainty, but it's cost. It's rising costs. We've got rail schedules affected. And we've got a couple of little interesting tidbits coming up. The West Coast Longshoremen's contract is up in 2022, and it's purported that they might strike again. I'll tell you what, they'd have some power if they did. There's also a new international shipping rule for emissions, which requires ships, cargo ships, to sail more slowly as they cross the Pacific and the Atlantic with your toothbrush going to Target. So will any of this kill manufacturing and supply chains even worse in the next year or so? Key Chinese factories are starting to shut down due to Delta. So none of it's pretty, and it may well last into 2023. There's no switch we're going to be flipping, folks. And as this unravels, the media's going to be like, oh, gee, well, look. And you know what it said at the end of the article on CNBC? It said, buy your Christmas presents now. Because there might be delays. You want something for your kid or something. There might well be delays. So buy them now. So we are starting to see the unseen in spades. And it's economists whose job it is to show us these trade-offs, to help us conceive of things which are not necessarily in front of our face or represented in the data. And they've been AWOL over the last year and a half. They've just been missing. So I'm going to indulge. This is a post, recent post by a famous free market libertarian economist. Says, yeah, U.S. GDP is now higher, in fact, a fair bit higher than when the pandemic began. Has inflation really changed enough to make the GDP numbers misleading? Yes. Was there really slack to the tune of a few million people in January of 2020? Slack means, underemployed resources of workers. Oh. Has total factor productivity improved that much in time under these stresses? Factor productivity basically means, how much output you get from how much input. This sort of navel-gazing question. Has factor productivity improved that much in that time? No. Everyone's been sitting home not working. So then he says, and it is a he, I'm not going to name his name. Or is all this a sign that the structure of the economy is more stratified than we think? That there are millions of people in more or less filler jobs who can be cast out of the economy, just keeps on running along? So when I read this kind of stuff, you might have heard the phrase homo economicus. This is when the left blasts us because, oh my God, you guys just look at everything in terms of dollars and numbers, and what about grandma? So when I read an economist and a free market economist saying this, what comes to mind is that this is clever masquerading as smart. And it's the kind of thing that makes people dislike economists. Sending everybody home without purpose or productivity for a year is going to have horrific human costs. Human beings need purpose as much as they need anything. So this kind of navel-gazing, this wondering aloud, gee, this COVID may be good for the economy. I don't know. We shut everything down for a year, we send everybody home, we suspend rent payments, and we're not going to suffer trade-offs. It makes me think, frankly, that economics as a profession is not doing society much good. It's not serving human beings. It's not helping us see the unseen. So a friend of mine, and he's definitely going to remain nameless, a friend of mine sent me a response. It's amazing how blanked up this person is. An economy is a way to get stuff. Is there more stuff or less stuff than when the pandemic began? Are there more cars or less? Are there more computers and personal digital devices or less? Is there more food or less? More oil or less? More business-to-business supply chain or less? But because this blank thinks the economy is symbolic architecture, not a real thing for getting real stuff, he's absolutely flummoxed by a simple question. And I thought that was spot on. Economics is about choice. It's about choices we make in the face of scarcity, about how we get the goods and services we want in an environment of trade-offs and uncertainty. So nothing could be more disastrous to that environment of trade-offs and uncertainty than vague, open-ended, ever-changing government lockdowns and rules. So this is an economic disaster, folks. We just don't know it yet because $12 trillion is sloshing around, making us feel good. So my point here is to suggest that the economics of the situation are worse than advertised, and that it's really economics that hold us together, right? All that stuff. That's what holds us together. When we think of America today, it's mostly, and I don't take any joy in saying this, because I love America. I feel very fortunate to have been born here. And I don't take any joy in saying this, but when we think about America today, we're mostly talking about an economic arrangement, let's face it. This isn't a social or cultural arrangement anymore. It's certainly not a political arrangement. This isn't really much of a country at this point. So what happens when the economics unravel? Well, I just have a few minutes left, so I want to leave you with the hopeful part of this talk. And I sent Daniel a title. When I talked, I said, Jeff, what's the title you're talking? I sent him a title, and then a couple days ago, can I change it? No, Jeff, you can't change it. So the title is The COVID Silver Lining, so I ought to live up to that a little bit anyway. I think there's a very happy upside to this great unraveling which we're all experiencing. Over the past 18 months, what we've learned is that all crises are local. No matter who you are, no matter where you are, I don't care if you're Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates. It mattered a lot in the last year and a half whether you were in Florida or New York. Your life was a lot different. It mattered. It mattered a hell of a lot whether you were in Sweden or Australia over the last 18 months. And so the physical world, the old world, the analog world came along and reasserted itself. And it turns out that no matter who you are or how rich you are, you think you live in this digital world. Well, guess what? You need calories that have to arrive into your home some way. You need electricity and energy. You may need prescription drugs. You may need some sort of medical care. You need all kinds of things in that old-fashioned physical world. And with this global supply chain, no matter how complex it is, you need that last mile delivery to your house or your Kroger or your Publix or whatever it is. Okay, that's the reality. We're still corporeal beings. So people are waking up, I think, to the reality of all this dysfunction in the federal government. I mean, we know now that the federal government can't manage COVID. It can't manage Afghanistan. It can't manage debt. It can't manage the dollar or spending or entitlements. It can't manage any of these things in a country of 330 million diverse people. It can't even run federal elections, much less provide security or justice or social cohesion. So how is it going to manage 50 states and 330 million people? There's something very profound happening. And I think of it as some sort of great awakening or a great realignment, and it's like centrifugal force, where things spin out away from the center. Because just imagine the value in this. If the 21st century sees the reversal of the single biggest political trend of the 19th and 20th centuries, namely the centralization of political power in central governments, national governments, sometimes even supranational governments, what if we're spinning the opposite way for the first time in centuries? What if we're going the other way? Well, it wasn't that long ago that Europe was principalities and duchies and city-states. It wasn't that long ago at all. And it wasn't that long ago we actually had these United States, right? So what if we're about to embark on an unbelievable experiment in localism and regionalism, not necessarily due to ideology or people agreeing with us, but simply due to the sheer dysfunction of national governments? Do you think they're going to be able to pay Social Security? Do you think they're going to be able to remake Iran? Do you think they're going to be able to defeat China in a war? Again, a kind of centrifugal force is at work. It's a beautiful thing. There was a United Van Line study conducted last year. You know, they're the shipping people, the house moving people. And it showed exactly what we all know. Everybody's leaving California and New York and New Jersey and Illinois, and they're going to Florida and Texas and Tennessee and Arizona, and they certainly are going to Boise, Idaho, which is just completely out of control. So what's happening here, folks, is a form of soft secession. It's political and ideological in a sense, but it's also geographic. And remember, just 10% of Americans, if we could get 10% of us on the same page, that's 33 million people. Okay, that's a political force. That's larger than a ton of European countries. 33 million people. If we can get 10% of non-knucklehead Americans, we could get somewhere. And you know, one way you can do that is have 3 or 4 or 5 kids yourself. But this shift, I'm telling you, this is unprecedented in American history, this shift away from cities towards the exurbs and the suburbs and the rural areas. We've never had this. We had colonial towns. Then people went to farms. Then in the Industrial Revolution, people went to places like Detroit and Pittsburgh and Chicago to work in that analog world I mentioned, making steel and tires and cars. And then in the Digital Revolution, they went to places like Silicon Valley and Seattle to get the good jobs. And they went to places like Manhattan to get the finance job. We just move money around instead of making stuff. Okay, that's been the dominant trend. If that trend reverses even slightly, if we're seeing a reversal of that, especially with the ability to work from home, I think that's going to be one of the biggest social changes and consequently economic and philosophical changes in American history. So there's a once-in-a-generation opportunity before us. The FedGov is far and away the biggest and most important institution in this country, whether we like it or not. That's the truth. It's bigger than the church. It's bigger than civic or social institutions. And yet, Gary Haven talked about the loss of faith in institutions. So it's been a centerpiece around which we organize society for more than 100 years now, since that rotten Wilson and the bitter fruits of the Progressive era. And that's a profoundly evil reality. So we should cheer when people start to lose faith in this central institution in our society, whether they lose faith because of Trump or COVID or Afghanistan or just these public opinion polls that have been telling us ever since Bush versus Gore how deeply divided we are. There's a growing sense, ladies and gentlemen, that DC is over. It's done. And it's time to turn it back.